Let's zoom out. Is this far-right insurgency? The march of the far-right we keep hearing?
Well, in Europe, voters in 27 countries have elected more far-right members to the European Parliament.
Breaking story that Macron called a snap election after huge far-right gains in elections to the European Parliament.
Far-right parties were expected to do well in these European elections, but their performance delivered a number of bombshells.
Or is there something else afoot?
If you'd said to me, as recently as the 2000s, or even the early 2010s, that the likes of Marine Le Pen would be finishing number one in France, at the same time as Giorgia Meloni finishes number one in Italy, at the same time as the Austrian Freedom Party finishes number one in Austria, at the same time as Geert Wilders takes over politics in the Netherlands, at the same time as the Alternative for Germany finishes second ahead of the centre-left Social Democrats, at the same time as parties like Vox in Spain, Viktor Orban in Hungary, do very well at these elections, I would have laughed you out of the room. This is a seismic event for the European Union.
What's your take in the similarities with what's going on in Europe, what's going on here in Britain, to what's going on in America?
Clearly, the populist mood is back. Clearly, the populist moment is back. And if you look at all the polling in the US, as we sit here talking in the early summer of 24, Trump's ahead in the national polls, but he's ahead in every single battleground state.
Are they really far right? Are they populist?
That term becomes meaningless.
The establishment elite are still contending with this movement.
Elites don't want to listen. You make it look like you're with the people, but you're not with the people. Where are you? You are in post-democracy. It's like many people, I think, in Britain, Europe, and probably America too, a palpable sense that we are now rapidly approaching a civilizational moment.
Hello and welcome to the Winston Marshall Show with me, Winston Marshall. In the wake of the European elections and the seeming rise of populism across the continent, I sat down with Matt Goodwin, expert on populism, to explore whether this is indeed the year of populism, whether 2024 is a repeat of 2016, whether it's something new altogether, or is this the far right, as the mainstream media tell us again and again. We look at the failure of the elites, the failure and the end of technocracy. We look at what's going on in Clacton and the Reform Party, what's going on in England, the failure and end of the Conservative Party. We look at what's going on in different countries across Europe and even what to expect with a Trump election on, or rather I should say, US presidential election on the horizon when Trump is favourite. All of that and much, much more. Before we hear from Matt, I ask, if you want to support the show, all you have to do is press subscribe. If you press subscribe, I can have more phenomenal guests like Matt Goodwin discussing the issues that you want to hear about. But without further ado, what is the truth about populism? Here is Matt Goodwin. Thank you for watching the Winston Marshall Show. You will have seen in the wake of the European parliamentary elections a whole wave of mainstream media headlines telling us that this is a far-right insurgent. Let me read some of those headlines. Far-right makes gains in EU election, but it could struggle to unite, says the BBC. Far-right makes significant gains in European Parliament elections, says the Financial Times. First national estimates show far-right gains in Austria and Germany, say Politico. First thing, far-right gains in EU polls prompt snap election in France, say The Guardian. So, as well as the elections, we have a lot of drama. The Belgian Prime Minister has resigned. Emmanuel Macron has called a snap election in France, a legislative election, given the success of Marine Le Pen's Rassemblement National. And as well as that, we have seen a wave of populist or if we're to believe the mainstream media, far-right parties in Central Europe. However, at the same time, there's parts of Europe, let's say Spain, Portugal, Sweden, Poland, where it's rather a different story. So to unpack this all, to unpack this new populist age, or is it a far-right age, we're going to dive into that, is expert on populism, author of National Populism, and friend of the show, Matt Goodwin. Matt, thanks for talking to me.
Good to be back.
Matt, tell me, you've been on the street with Farage and Clacton. You are expertly positioned to tell us about what's going on in English populism. But before we go there, let's zoom out. Is this a far-right insurgency, the march of the far-right we keep hearing, or is there something else afoot? What are we to make? Is this even populism? Is actually, if you look at what's actually changed in the European Parliament, it's not that much. The European People's Party, Ursula von der Leyen's group, are still the main party. There's not much change there. Is this all over-egged, over-exaggerated, or is this a real shift for Europe? What do you think?
Well, I think firstly, these were the best set of elections for national populists in the history of European Parliament elections. And I'll come back to what I mean by the term national populist in a second. But look, just step back for a minute. If you're not familiar with European politics, with politics in the West, just step back with me for a minute, because what you need to do is take the long-term view here. Now, if you'd said to me, as recently as the 2000s, or even the early 2010s, that the likes of Marine Le Pen would be finishing number one in France at the same time as Giorgia Meloni finishes number one in Italy, at the same time as the Austrian Freedom Party finishes number one in Austria, at the same time as Geert Wilders takes over politics in the Netherlands, at the same time as the Alternative for Germany finishes second ahead of the centre-left Social Democrats, at the same time as parties like Vox in Spain, Viktor Orban in Hungary do very well at these elections, I would have laughed you out of the room. This is a seismic event for the European Union. Yes, these parties are divided. Yes, they will struggle to have serious influence at the European level because of those divisions. But the strength of their support, the durability of their support, the expansion of their support, much of which, by the way, is coming from young Europeans, not just angry old white men, is actually a very significant moment for Europe. So as I've been arguing for 10 years or more, national populism is going to keep getting bigger and bigger until we actually address the reasons why people are voting for these parties. But first of all, let's clear up. I think you want to talk about what do we mean by these terms?
Yeah, absolutely. So, like, one thing that's kind of frustrating is that you hear far right so often now that it's lost its meaning. And so in preparation for this, I've done some research into these various parties to try and work out, are they really far right? Are they populist? And perhaps we can look at a couple of them. But when you use the word populist, what do you mean?
So let's be very clear, and just so viewers are aware, I'm coming from the academic literature on populism. So there's 50 years of research on populist parties. And in that world, nobody who is serious uses the term far right. There is a consensus among scholars that far right as a term, as a label, is meaningless. Why? Because it's used to basically include movements that are so different from one another. You know, the British Conservatives have been described as far right. Suella Braverman has been described as far right. From that all the way through to extreme parties and movements such as, say, Golden Dawn in Greece a few years ago, or neo-Nazi groups in Germany. So when you have that much variation under a term, that term becomes meaningless. The term I use is national populist. Now, what do we mean by that? We mean a movement that prioritizes the culture and the interests of the majority group against an elite that it argues is corrupt, self-serving, or neglectful. National populism is a distinctive movement in its own right. It is radical because it challenges the status quo, but it is not extreme because it is not calling for the complete overthrow of the status quo and the political system. So we need to be clear here. Radical movements accept the society we live in, but they want to radically change that society. Extreme movements want to completely overthrow the institutions of that society. They're openly anti-democratic, and they are often openly racist. National populists, I would argue, are different. They are democratic in the sense that they advocate a direct conception of democracy, What do we mean by that? They want to put the majority will ahead of institutions and the sort of the kind of liberal aspects of democracy. Their beginning and end point is the majority will, the interests of the majority group, and they want to give the people, as they see it, a sort of organic, homogenous people, more power in politics, more of a voice in politics. Now that is quite different from a liberal conception of democracy, which prioritizes individual rights. But it is a conception of democracy. It's a classical Athenian conception of democracy. So we need to be clear about that. Now what liberals tend to do, especially liberal progressives, is they will use terms like far right. They will expand them to basically include all of those movements that they don't like, and they will use these terms to try and shut down debate. So if you critique mass immigration, which lots of people do, they say, look, actually, it's not good for the economy, it undermines social trust, it undermines support for the welfare state, lots of evidence for that. Liberal progressives will say, yes, but that position is far right, implicitly associating it with Nazism and fascism as a way of trying to discredit that political position. They will also use the term far right to imply that many of these parties are openly anti-democratic. Well, actually, they're not anti-democratic. This is a controversial point, but very few national populists in Europe want to leave the European Union. Very few of them are saying, I'm actually done with democracy, let's try something else.
Although I'm not sure that leaving the European Union would be a sign of being anti-democratic, because plenty would argue that the European Union is not particularly democratic.
Well, I would argue the European Union is not a democratic organisation.
So if you're pro-democracy, you could say leaving the EU is more democratic.
And again, but it's an important point, just to be clear on that, the EU is not democratic because it has no meaningful competition for executive office. So let's be clear about that. Real democracies have meaningful competition for executive office. The European Union does not have that. That's why it's not a democratic organization. But anyway, so liberal progressives will use terms like far right, hate, misinformation, disinformation, these are the new ones, to basically try and control and contain the parameters of the national conversation as a way of saying these movements are socially unacceptable and these movements are completely acceptable. And I've been in this debate, this research for 20, 25 years, and I've seen this firsthand because there are two things going on. One is national populist parties are becoming more popular as the issues they campaign on, mass immigration, radical Islam, are becoming much more important and influential in people's lives. People are becoming much more concerned about the direction of Western societies. But the other thing that's happening is that the cultural left, liberal progressives, have also radicalized over the last 20 years. So they've moved further to the cultural left as what Americans might call the Great Awakening. They've become much more committed to immigration, more supportive of it. They've become much more passionate about defending and expanding minority rights. They become much more willing to sacrifice free speech on the altar of things like social justice. And so as these two things have happened simultaneously, liberal progressives have tried to shut down the marketplace of ideas. They've tried to say, well, all of this stuff is far right. This is not consistent with our belief system. But at the same time, millions of people are sort of sensing the closing down of that public marketplace and are becoming more supportive of populists because they're saying, well, look, I haven't got a voice in this conversation and I want to reassert my voice within this national debate. And that's why we're seeing these parties dominating the polls. It is entirely plausible that Marine Le Pen's party will take over the French political system, not just this year, but over the next 5 years with presidential elections and so on. We would never have said that 10 years ago or 20 years ago. It is entirely plausible that national populists will end up controlling not just Sweden, the Netherlands, Italy, and France, but will likely end up controlling countries like Austria, as they are already in Hungary and have recently been in Poland. And as in Britain now, we see Nigel Farage and the Reform Party, even countries that have gone through historic turning points, like the Brexit referendum, shows that actually national populism isn't really going anywhere. It's just getting stronger and stronger as elites fail to deal with these issues.
I want to come back to issues, and not just what are the issues that populists care about, but also where is the failures, some of which you've just alluded to, of the establishment, the entrenched political elite that have been in charge for so long. But I think it's just worth exploring again some of these semantics. And I know no one likes a sort of pedant, but for example, you say Hungary is national populist, but I've heard Orban reject being labelled as a populist himself. He himself even conflates it with demagoguery. But let's look at the alternative for Deutschland, because whenever a German party gets nationalistic, everyone around the world gets a bit concerned and worried. Now, it's kind of confusing, this one, because on the one hand, if you read their manifesto, it's basically conservative and not particularly offensive. On the other hand, there are people who come out, former insiders, whistleblowers, who have said, yes, there's neo-Nazis in the party, and this has been illustrated very clearly by Maximilian Krah, who was the leading MEP for the Alternative for Deutschland, who said in an interview in Italy that not everyone in the SS was a criminal, or something like that, I paraphrase. And as a consequence, Marine Le Pen won't align with them in the European Parliament. She's decided the Alternative for Deutschland are too extreme for her and her politics. So maybe we should just look at the Alternative for Deutschland. Do you think that they are a far-right party, or what do you make of this? What's your insight into that particular group?
Well, as I say, I don't think the term far-right is helpful, and we should challenge these inflated terms whenever they enter the public discourse. I think, so the question is the AfD a national populist, a radical right party, or is it a full-blown neo-Nazi party? Now, Germany has the Office for the Protection of the Constitution. If parties are designated neo-Nazi, neo-fascist in Germany, they are banned outright. So clearly there is not yet sufficient evidence for the German state to ban the AfD. These parties are notorious for attracting people on the fringes of political life, much like centre-left and left-wing parties, even though we hear much less about it, are notorious for attracting people on the extreme left wing, Antifa people, for example, or people who glorify Chairman Mao, or people who glorify, many of the other horrific things that happen around the world. But what I'm saying is the balance is not always there within our public discussion. The AfD, if there was enough evidence to say this is a full-blown neo-Nazi organisation, it would be banned, which in my mind leaves it within the national populist radical right terminology. It's a party that rejects the establishment consensus on things like net zero, on the European Union, on mass migration. It advocates a direct conception of democracy, saying it wants to put more power back into the hands of ordinary people. And it obviously has very specific countercultural views on issues around mass migration, and in particular, the role of radical Islam within Western society, within German society. Now, if we're going along this line of saying, well, criticizing Islam is now far right, personally, I think that's a very dangerous place for Western societies to be. We have to protect and defend our right to criticize anything and everything we want to within our liberal Western societies. So I don't think the AfD is a neo-Nazi organization. It might attract individual neo-Nazis to it, but in terms of its constitution, its program, its guiding philosophy, I personally don't think it is a neo-Nazi organization. And if it were, the German state would ban it.
What insight do you have into Viktor Orban's party? So again, I don't speak Hungarian, despite having some Hungarian heritage. It's quite, if you really look into it, it gets a bit tricky because it's a very alien language. You've spent time with him at the National Conservative Conference this last couple of months ago, I believe. What's your insight into how Hungary functions as a country? Is this a part of the he rejects being populist? Is he just kind of a conservative Christian Democrat, as he describes, or how should we understand what's going on there?
Well, I think one of the most important points in understanding what's happening in not just Hungary but across large parts of Central and Eastern Europe is the sort of the calculation that led them into the European Union to begin with. And I've been influenced by some of the writing by people like Ivan Krastev and others who have said, look, when countries like Hungary and Poland join the European Union, they basically took an economic assessment. They thought it would be good for their economy, and they bought into the idea of economic liberalism, that by opening up their markets, by opening up their economies, this would be good for their societies and would help them move past the Cold War and the influence of the Soviet Union and Russia. What they didn't count on at the time, which is an argument Krastov makes very eloquently, is that they would also have to accept the imposition of socially liberal values, priorities, tastes and beliefs within their society. And the moment that became clear through things like the arrival of mass migration, refugees, the imposition of, let's say, socially liberal belief systems around same-sex marriage or the teaching of LGBTQ plus issues to kids, they became instinctively hostile to that. So Orban has openly campaigned on that and said, look, we have to be able to decide how we want to live and how we want to function, how our society should function. And so he has described himself, I think, in interesting ways as a sort of almost living in an illiberal democracy, and saying it's a democratic society, but it's one that doesn't take socially liberal values as its North Star. It takes a different set of values. It actually says boundaries are important. Cultural guardrails are important, marriage is important, national identity is important, our sense of collective history, memory, and values. These are all things that are important. And in liberal societies, actually what you get over time is the erosion of those guardrails, and you get excessive individual liberty, excessive individual rights, excessive minority rights that are prioritized above the interests and the values and the identity of the majority. So again, it's the hallmarks of, he might reject the term, but it's what I would describe national populism, which is embedding a principle of national preference into those societies. The majority national group, not necessarily defined by race and ethnicity, the majority national group comes before others in terms of the economy, housing, culture, values, history, and so on. Liberals reject that. They say, actually, national preference, not interested in that. We're interested in the imposition of universal liberal themes on those societies. So we're interested in the celebration of multiculturalism, the celebration of diversity, and the celebration of individual rights, irrespective, basically, of where you're from. And that is really the fault line. So populists are saying, we want to defend who we are within the context of our nation states, within the context of a direct conception of democracy, and we don't just want our national culture, our history, our memory to be absorbed into globalization and these other universal liberal currents.
There's an example of this in France where it tests the boundaries of my liberalism, I guess, or rather it irks me as I still consider myself liberal, is Marine Le Pen has this policy of national preference, which is that there'll be preferences across society if you are French-born and your parents are French-born. And this, I guess, it would be an example of this type of policy.
Le Pen not only says she wants national preference, which, to be frank, to put my politics on the table so everyone's aware, I don't personally think there is anything wrong with that. I think if your families have been paying into the collective pot over the course of generations, then I do think actually the majority group should be prioritized above everybody else. It's my personal politics.
Yeah,
but what she's also saying, crucially, is on the economic axis, she's saying national preference has consistently been eroded by large-scale global corporations that have no interest in the well-being of the national community. This is where Le Pen is very different from, say, Nigel Farage. Farage will be critical of corporations, but he won't go anywhere near as far as Le Pen, who will say, look, the national interest is not only being undermined by mass migration and by radical Islam, the national interest is being undermined by global corporations that are just as comfortable trading in New York and Tokyo and Paris and Rome as they might be trading in, Marseille or wherever. So she's much more economically protectionist, interestingly, is where Trump is going now as well, by the way. She's much more economically protectionist than, say, the Thatcherites and the libertarians.
One of the key fundamentals to what I see as the populist movement is anti-globalization. In a way, you might describe some of these establishment parties as post-nationalist in part of the progressive worldview. It almost seems like a post-nationalist movement that we're now getting into, even young people, you alluded to this earlier in the conversation, in Germany, and it's east of the Elbe, curiously, it's old Prussia, where young people under 30s, Gen Z, are voting for AfD. And they have a concept of patriotism. They have a concept of community that is a rejection of that globalist mindset. How fundamental to, let's put it this way, to one way of approaching the puzzle of what is the populist policy or what is populist issues is to be what they stand for. But another way is, what are the failures of the liberal establishment that have been, and one has been globalization.
Yeah, for sure. Well, that's one of the biggest. I mean, if you go back to the late 90s, some of your viewers might not remember this, but I do. In the mid to late 90s, globalization was the new, sexy, fashionable thing. Everybody from, Tony Blair to Bill Clinton told us that globalization would lift all boats, that it would improve standards of living across the West, and it would make our economies much more dynamic. Remember, globalization has two pillars: economic, deregulate economies, open them up to competition from overseas, and cultural, bring in large amounts of migration to ensure you have a constant supply of cheap labor, right? That's globalization in a nutshell. The only thing is, Winston, it didn't work out that way. As we now know from a lot of evidence in economics, what really happened with globalization is it undermined not just the wages and not just the labor prospects of working class voters in Western economies, but it also did many other things. It undermined the social fabric in industrial communities. It even weakened relationships. It resulted in more divorces. It broke down marriages. And
how did that happen?
Because when you're living in an economically depressed environment, the chance of social breakdown becomes much greater. And so there's a lot of studies showing that globalization not only resulted in the collapse of social order in those communities and things like marriage, but it also drove things like drug and alcohol addiction. So things like what are now called the deaths of despair by scholars like Angus Deaton and others. They've shown that globalization basically tore through these communities, leaving carnage in its wake. Tony Blair, famously in 2005 said, basically anybody who critiques globalization is an idiot. They're closed-minded, they don't get it. Well, that was wrong. We now know actually globalization set the stage for everything we've lived through in the last 10 years. The votes for Trump, the votes for Brexit, the rise of populism in Europe, because rightly, millions of voters have said, hang on a minute, this isn't actually helping me in the economy. And the other effects of globalization, like mass immigration, they're taking more out of European economies than they're putting in. We now know this from research at the University of Amsterdam and elsewhere. The kinds of migration that have accompanied globalization are not the kinds of migration we should be encouraging. They're low wage, they're low skill. They're from culturally, I would argue, not just dissimilar, but arguably incompatible nations outside of Europe that are putting further strain on the social contract. And so globalization has been a massive elite failure. I mean, we're talking in Britain. Well, okay, show me where the high rates of growth are. Show me where the high productivity is. Show me where inequality has fallen. Show me where the left behind regions have returned. Show me where immigration has driven GDP per head, not just GDP. It's not happening. And the reason is the economic model that came with globalization has failed. Voters can sense that. They can see that. The only people who can't sense that are the people who told us to do it in the first place, which is basically the ruling elite. On the left and the right, they said, open up the economies, open up your culture, everything will be great. Turns out, didn't happen that way.
How much do you think geopolitics comes into the populist movement? Israel, Gaza, Ukraine, Russia, and NATO. Someone like Maloney, who was at one point somewhat sympathetic to Russia, has very much come down in support of Ukraine since the war began. But do ordinary people care about these things?
I don't think the Ukraine issue, I mean, certainly in terms of it being connected to energy, it plays a role, as we can see in countries like Germany. But I think more significant in this regard has been the Israel-Gaza conflict, because what October 7th and its aftermath has done is made it impossible to ignore the point that we now have millions of people in Western societies who hate Western societies, who hate our values, our culture and ways of life. And we have seen the emergence of an alliance between a radicalized cultural left, which is I would argue, anti-Semitic, is hostile towards Western nations, their history and culture, in alliance loosely with a radical Islamism within Western societies. Now, what do those two things have in common, and why are they creating space for populists? Well, they're both illiberal. They have no interest in liberalism. They both put group identities above individual rights, right? They're obsessed with identity politics or fixed religious identities. They're both iconoclastic. They have rituals, they have chants, they are religious in their outlook. You know, John McWhorter at Columbia has famously referred to the woke left as a new religion, and I think radical Islamists are very similar. They don't really want to live in a democracy. They don't really want the bargaining and the compromise and the nuance that come with a democracy, and they would both happily sacrifice free speech and free expression on the altar of their ideology. So I'm very concerned about how they are combining and forging this alliance. Now, the reason populists have become much bigger in Europe is because millions of voters can see that. They can see what's happening within their societies. Take radical Islam as an example. It isn't just the security threat that it poses. You know, I've read a report recently that France has busted 30 serious terrorist plots since the attacks in 2015. 30. Low-level violence in France, in French society, has become a fact of life. The beheadings of teachers, the kidnappings, the mass violence that we've seen, the riots. France, you know, I've been going to France since I was 5 years old. To be frank, it's not really, I don't think Paris and so on are particularly nice places to go today. That's my personal view. You have a visceral sense that society is under threat, and voters can sense that. Now, if you look at, say, where Europe is going over the next 10, 20 years, well, what's going to happen when, as the projections show from credible institutes like the Pew Research Center in America, they show by 2050, if Europe maintains its current migration flows, the share of France's population that will be Muslim is going to be over 20%, Sweden over 30%, Germany about 20%. You're going to see more than a doubling in the share of populations in Europe that are Muslim. Now, many Muslims reject extremism and radicalism, and they abhor the things they've seen since October 7th, the chanting of anti-Semitic slogans and so on. But the blunt reality, Winston, is this is going to introduce a challenge to European societies on a scale they've never seen. And I suspect the big winners from that will be national populists, unless we do two things. We dramatically lower the rate of migration into Europe, and we simultaneously invest much more seriously in integrating newcomers into the wider story of who we are. What is it that makes us distinctive? Not a universal, globalist, bland identity around celebrating difference, but absorbing people into what our story is, our history, our values, our culture. Unless we do those two things, what we're seeing now is only going to accelerate throughout the rest of the 2020s and the 2030s.
Yeah, so that ties into I guess one of the other issues is patriotism and nationalism. And nationalism, I was growing up, as a dirty word because it's not understood as in sort of the Westphalian sense of nation-statism. It's understood in a sort of, you just think German, you think of the Nazis, I guess. That's sort of how it was taught in school. But is there a healthy nationalism that is one of the issues underneath the populist movement, i.e. a sense of community, a sense of patriotism, a sense of a more local government rather than the giant EU? How significant an issue is nationalism to the populist movement?
Well, nationalism, broadly defined, is at the very heart of national populism. They want to put the majority group ahead of an elite minority, which they argue is no longer interested in serving the interests of that national community. What do they mean by national? Well, liberal progressives would have you believe they mean white people, but actually most national populists reject that framing. They are referring to members of the dominant national group, irrespective of their race and ethnicity, who share a sense of cultural commonality, who share a sense of values, a shared sense of history, who support the institutions and the symbols of that national community. They're not expansionary as they were in the mid-20th century. They're not talking about expanding their living space. They're not defining that national community in terms of a very narrow race-based conception of what it means to be part of the nation. They're ethno-pluralist in the sense that you can be, say, Black British and be part of that national community, so long as you're subscribing to what it is that makes us part of this place we call home. And so I think as they've expanded that definition, and you see this, for example, in Le Pen's party, where she's had many people from minority backgrounds representing her in politics. You see it in Nigel Farage's movement, where famously when he gave the conference and saying he's not leading a racist party, most of the people on the stage were from minority backgrounds who were standing for his previous UK Independence Party. So the definition of who we are has expanded as our societies have become more diverse. Now, liberal progressives refuse to accept that because they say, well, actually, deep down, this is about racism. But how can it be then that these parties have become much more successful at exactly the same time as every major survey in social science shows Western nations have become much less racist? So they can't square that hole. So I don't think racism is driving these parties forward. I think it is much more a sense that the national community, broadly defined, is now at risk of losing what it is that makes it a national community to begin with.
Another important issue that comes up in a lot of the manifestos for these different populist parties is the environment, is green policy, and we have seen the green parties obliterated in they've done very badly, let's put it that way, in the European parliamentary elections and the results. How important is that? I mean, immediately it comes to mind Germany's insane nuclear policy to close down their nuclear plants, and then they're just importing nuclear energy now from France. But obviously that hurts the pockets of working people, of young people, because they have to pay more. So for more expensive energy. How significant a part is environmentalism, is climate catastrophizing part of this populist movement?
I think it's very significant. Only a few years ago, every academic under the sun was telling us that we were going to have a green surge in European politics, largely because most academics support the Greens or radical left movements. So they were very supportive of what was happening. It was quite obvious that this was going to end in election disaster because the policies that many Green parties have been bringing forward are not realistically anchored in the life experiences of ordinary voters. Net zero is a great example of that. When you're basically asking people to pay more for energy, for driving their cars around London with the ULEZ charges, when you're imposing net zero type taxation and fiscal costs on people because of a policy that is much more strongly celebrated among the elite class, there are going to be political consequences, and we're now seeing those consequences across much of Europe. Working people have been hit on multiple fronts: inflation from COVID, the furlough, the lockdowns. The cost of living has gone through the roof. At the same time as the elites have imposed this net zero project on everybody else top down. There's a great example of this here in the UK. We had a local council that was investing millions of pounds in expanding net zero. So it actually wanted to go net zero 10 years before the rest of the country. And at the same time, as local council left-wing elites were pushing these policies, the local library was closed down. Core public services couldn't be delivered. Old people weren't getting meals on wheels, where they get food taken to their house. It's a great example of the luxury belief class advocating policies that bring them benefits, that make them feel good, that give them a sense of moral righteousness, but which antagonize everybody else who actually has to live with the consequences of those decisions. And this is where I think we are with a lot of the green movements in Europe. Don't forget too, politically, their support is concentrated in the big cities, university towns. So unlike the National Populists, it is harder often for Green parties to build a very big, durable, wide coalition of support of the kind that we've seen in places like Eastern Germany, or places like we've seen in the east coast of England or the industrial heartlands in France. It's more difficult for Green parties to sustain themselves over the longer term. But of course, energy is part of it. But At the core of all of these parties is the immigration population nexus. That is what ultimately this is all about. The more immigration, the better these parties will do. That is basically the bottom line of what's going on here.
Look, I want to come to what's going on here in Britain. But before I do, a lot of what you're talking about, you wrote about this in your book on national populism. A lot of this stuff was somewhat obvious back in 2016 for anyone who took the time for some self-reflection to try and understand the political movements at play then. So how is it that 8 years later, we're still not, or rather the establishment elite are still contending with this movement? Wouldn't it be as simple as listening to ordinary people, listening to working people as to what it is they care about? How are we still in the, how has this populist age not been nipped in the bud?
Elites don't want to listen. We're nearly 10 years on from 2016. There has been no meaningful, serious attempt to respond to the grievances that voters put on the table, not just in 2016, but through the early 2010s and through the 2000s, when the likes of Marine Le Pen and Nigel Farage were first on the rise. There has been no serious response to the request for...
The response is, what I've just said in this conversation, is that they just smear it all as far right instead of engaging.
There's been no response to the request for less immigration. There's been no response to the request for slower demographic and population change. There's been no request to...
Well, the response is that it's all been worse.
There's been no response to the request to push back hard against woke ideologies that basically undermine our history, our values, and who we are. And there has been a consistent attempt from the aftermath of Donald Trump to Brexit to Europe, as you know through your debate at the Oxford Union with Nancy Pelosi, has been an attempt to denigrate populist voters as extremists, fascists, anti-democrats. I mean, the insurrection stuff in the US in the aftermath of the January riot, I thought was emblematic of this, much in the same way as the response to Brexit here was, which is fundamentally, for a radicalized liberal elite class that really now believes it's under siege on all fronts, that really genuinely believes it's living through the reincarnation of the Third Reich, that believes the fascists are at the gates. Number one tells us how isolated and detached that elite class has become from everybody else in society, how little interaction they're having with everybody else in society. Because if they were going to places like Clacton in England, where Nigel Farage is running, or they were spending genuine amounts of time in the Midwest and actually sitting in these communities, it'd become pretty bloody obvious very quickly that they're not living through those things. But we've seen them radicalize over the last 10, 20 years, where they now genuinely believe that the movements they are facing are anti-democratic, fascist, revolutionary movements, when in reality, in most of the cases, they're actually movements that just have a different view as to what the consensus should be in our societies. They don't agree with mass immigration. Most of them say we'll have some immigration, we don't want mass immigration. They say it's important to protect who we are. We don't just want to erode that by clinging to these universal liberal themes that don't really mean anything. They want to put the voice and the values of ordinary people into the political debate. The elites don't want to do that. They're used to having power. They've consolidated their power. They don't want to give up their power. So they dominate not just politics, but the media class, the creative class, the cultural class. They just don't, ultimately, they don't want to give up power.
So I would actually... this is some insight I got from my experience with Pelosi, but I think you mentioned Tony Blair, and I think it applies to a lot of these globalist elites, is that for them to actually have the self-reflection and see why is it that these movements are going away from their own worldview would be to have to address what they themselves had done as politicians, as elites, but also it would mean to almost to deconstruct their entire worldview, which would be a psychologically painful experience for them. So on a personal, individual level, there's not the incentive for them to do that, to deal with the fact that maybe their entire career had done serious damage to the world.
I think you're spot on, but I think also I'd go further. I'd say for people on the liberal progressive left, we're not talking about a rational interpretation of a political ideology. We are talking about a religion. They view their project as a religion. So when I talk to them, I've briefed Labour leaders on Nigel Farage's support. I remember in 2015 saying to Ed Miliband and Labour, if you don't get on this, actually 2013, if you don't get on this, if you don't actually address the concerns of your voters, this populist revolt is going to become enormous. And what happened? Brexit, Farage, and now here we are again with Farage breaking through. Why? They didn't listen. Because every time I said, you do understand most people don't want mass migration. You do understand most people want to feel proud of where they come from. You do understand that most people don't want to see their identity and their history and their values just maligned and thrown to one side by this woke ideology stuff that says actually you should be more ashamed than proud of who you are. They just kind of glaze over. It's the righteous mind stuff that people like John Haidt's talked about. They just cannot relate to the fact that for many people out there, group loyalty, group identity, a sense of respect for the national community and for the boundaries that make us who we are, liberals just really struggle to relate to that. And just one last point, because this is really, I think this is really important about this discussion about elites. If you look at who has made these decisions, mass migration, globalization, often they are people who derive their legitimacy and their esteem and their status not from their relationship with the voters below, but from their relationship with other elites. And just very briefly, for viewers internationally, why this is important, why is Rishi Sunak in such trouble in Britain? Why is he leading the Conservative Party into the abyss? One thing happened during this campaign that was very revealing. He went to the D-Day 80th anniversary in France, and he left early, because he thought it was more important to come back and try and campaign to hold on to his power than actually celebrate and mark the sacrifices that our ancestors had made on the beaches of France to liberate Europe. Now, what does that tell us? It tells us, firstly, on the surface, that Rishi Sunak has got terrible advisors and his instincts are off. Okay, but that's not actually the story. The story is it confirms to millions of voters that he is part of an elite that actually is more interested in cementing their position as part of that global elite than protecting and promoting what it is that gives us a distinctive sense of identity, history, and collective memory. He is like Nick Clegg, who could not wait to leave the UK and go and work for Facebook. He's like Tony Blair, who could not wait to basically create a global consultancy doing all kinds of dodgy deals with dodgy dictators. He's like this global elite class that is now, as Chris Lash once said in The Revolt of the Elites in 1993, which is a phenomenal book. He wrote it on his deathbed. He saw all of this coming. He said, the thing is, it's not that they're not interested in the fellow members of their national community. It's that they don't like them anymore. They actively disdain members of their national community. They view them as low status. I sit in meetings with senior Tories in Britain all the time. They view the debates that we're talking about, immigration, radical Islam, what's happening to our cultural values. These are low status issues for them. They don't want to talk about that because it threatens their sense of esteem, their sense of recognition, their sense of moral righteousness among other members of the elite class. And once you understand that's how they see the world, everything just makes a lot more sense. And that's why these populists are doing so well. They're stepping into the vacuum that's been left by an elite class that is no longer interested in serving and representing and respecting fellow members of their national community.
Let's just talk about that vacuum, because it seemed to me, particularly after Boris won the election here, even though he was up against a left-wing populist under Corbyn in 2019, that and after Brexit, that there was a move from the Conservatives away from technocracy that we'd experienced under Cameron and his coalition with Clegg, as well as, the 1 year when the Conservatives had a majority. Then we have this move back to Rishi, which seemed like a reversion to that technocracy. He put Cameron in as foreign secretary. It was like they had not learnt any of the lessons from the last 8 years. It seems so blatantly obvious, and it's almost like every decision Rishi makes, it's a continuation of that. There's no self-reflection.
It's entirely predictable. One of the books that had an influence on me, written in 2000, was Post-Democracy by an academic called Colin Crouch. And he said basically what's happening is the heart and soul of democracies are getting torn out. They're getting eroded. They're getting hollowed out through the rise of spin doctors, focus groups, opinion polling, technocratic advisors, institutions like the European Union. Peter Mayer, another very famous academic, wrote another great book called Ruling the Void, in which he said the problem within the European project is actually not the rise of populism per se, but is this enormous gulf that now separates a technocratic class of elites from ordinary people. And whereas once upon a time you had the golden age of representative democracy, where people would go out and meet voters, elites would go and meet voters, they would campaign with voters. The only person who's doing that in British politics today is Nigel Farage. When I was in Clacton with him, walking down streets...
Galloway's doing it.
George Galloway's doing it. Rishi Sunak isn't doing it. Keir Starmer isn't doing it. It's all stage managed. It's a warehouse on the outskirts of a town where you bus in your activists, you bus in your loyalists, you make it look like you're with the people, but you're not with the people. Where are you? You are in post-democracy. So if you want to understand why populists are cutting through, it's not just because they're talking about these issues. It's because they're actually doing democracy. They are with the demos. They are with the people. Now, unless mainstream parties can get back to doing that, I think they're going to continuously struggle to actually reconnect with voters, because we're not, the thing that the most striking aspect about populism for me now is not just how well they're doing at elections, but just how many young people who have no memory at all of what politics used to be like are voting for them. They have no memory at all of the 60s and the 70s and the 80s when my dad would vote Labour and his dad would vote Labour. All that stuff's gone. Tribal allegiances are gone. So you've got a new generation now who actually like these parties because they're better at social media, they're knocking on your doors, and they're talking about stuff that actually is quite important, like the rise of trans ideology, radical Islam, migration, stuff that people want to talk about. So the elites are not only not talking about those issues, they're not even talking to ordinary people about those issues. And that is where you get this enormous vacuum for Farage, for Le Pen, for Maloney, and so on.
I don't mean to keep nailing Rishi, but another thing that's so frustrating is that even if he had some humility to engage with, or even if he didn't have the humility to engage with the electorate or the people of Britain, the mandate in 2019 for the Conservative Party was fairly clear: deliver Brexit, levelling up, and support the NHS. He hasn't, it's almost like he's completely ignored that. Now, you might say that Brexit has been mainly sorted, but I guess, do you have any insight into Rishi's complete sort of? It seems like his aim is to get negative amount of seats for the Tory party. He's aiming for zero.
I know there's
net zero seats for the Tories.
There is a very, very important question here, and I'm not going to claim credit for it because Douglas Murray asked it during a conversation we had recently in London, and it's a very good point. He said, "What's this all for? What is Rishi Sunak for?" The Tory elites who fell over themselves during the Boris Johnson administration to say we must get rid of Boris, they then fell over themselves to say we must get rid of Liz Truss, and they then fell over themselves to say we must install Rishi Sunak and get the adults back in charge. That was essentially the narrative among a sort of Tory elite class supported by large chunks of the media. So here's my question. What was it all for? What's the project? To ban smoking? To reform A-levels? To turn down high-speed rail? What's Rishi Sunak done? What's the programme? What's the transformative vision? What on earth is this project for? Nobody can answer that question. They can say what they didn't like about Boris Johnson. They can say what they didn't like about Liz Truss. But what is this for? Because what it's given us is an average Conservative rating in the polls of 21%. It's given us a party that is heading into the electoral abyss, the worst defeat for the Conservative Party in the history of the Conservative Party. Unless the polls suddenly change, we are heading for a complete wipeout of the 2024 general election. And it's kind of pulled back the curtain to reveal that there is no brain trust behind Rishi Sunak. He's basically an over-promoted technocrat who is not a prime minister, clearly. At best is a reasonable business secretary who has no vision for the country and looks completely out of his depth. Now, I understand all of the criticisms about Boris Johnson and Liz Truss. I understand all of that. I was not a fan of Boris Johnson for different reasons. I don't think he was a genuine Conservative. I think he set the stage in many ways for the collapse of the Conservatives by liberalising migration and by not doing many of the things he said. But at least Johnson and Truss actually had a vision for where they were trying to get to. Truss, for all her failings, she said, this economic model isn't working, we need to change it. She was right on that, by the way. And Johnson, he said, you know what? Brexit was pushed through by popular sovereignty. We've got to deliver it or we're going to lose the confidence of the masses and this is going to get pretty dicey and pretty dangerous. And he delivered it. They had a vision of fundamental radical change. That's why the elites got so scared. Because they were challenging the elite consensus. They were challenging the status quo. What's Rishi Sunak given us? Managerialism, technocracy. The best thing he could come up with in that leadership conference speech last year was banning smoking. Are you serious? This is the pinnacle of conservative thought in 2024. It's ridiculous. Everybody can see it. Voters can see it, which is why he is now leading that party into the abyss and Nigel Farage is back.
So, you've been in Clacton, in Essex, with Farage. What are you doing there, Matt?
I am watching what's happening on the ground. I think we're at one of the most important moments in British politics for many years. I think Nigel Farage, if he's elected in Clacton, which I suspect he will, I think he's going to go on and deliver some very serious, meaningful change in British politics by realigning the right and by extension, changing the direction of conservatism and longer term the country. He won't do that by himself. There will need to be others involved with that, but he is, I think, going to cement his position as one of the most influential and impactful politicians in contemporary British history. And I want to say on the record, I think Farage is right to do that, which is another reason I was in Clacton. I think this country is in a very precarious place with a very large Labour government incoming, which is going to put on steroids all of the things millions of people are concerned about and I'm concerned about. Mass legal migration, the acceleration of the small boats crisis. Labour doesn't have a plan for that. The mainstreaming of woke, un-British ideology in our schools and universities, the embedding of identity politics in government departments and civil service and government contracts, wholesale constitutional change, including giving 16-year-olds the vote, reforming our institutions, expanding what we might call the quangocracy, the bureaucracy, the unelected elite class presiding over a growing number of decisions that affect our daily lives. I don't think that's a good thing. I'll put my colours here on, pin my colours to the mast.
Well, if Gen Z are turning right, that might,
I think
you might get your way.
I don't think the Reform Party is a perfect vessel. I don't think Nigel Farage is a perfect vessel. But I think he's asking the right questions. He's the only one in this campaign who said, hang on a minute, where's this mass migration leading us? Hang on a minute, why aren't these people integrating into our communities? Hang on a minute, if you're Jewish in Britain, why are you feeling so unsafe and insecure? He's the only one actually on the campaign trail who's dared to ask those questions, and he was shot down by the elite class for doing so. We need to ask those questions, and that's another reason I was in Clacton. I'm not saying I'm voting for the Reform Party. I think you can get a sense of where my politics lies. I think he's right. He's asking the right questions, and nobody else is. And that's a reflection of how weak and adrift the elite class in Britain, like all Western democracies, has become.
Can you paint a picture of what's going on in Clacton? We've seen footage of Farage being milkshaked. We had another man throw, it seemed like a brick at him whilst he was on top of his bus. Are these single data points that stand out? Is this representative of what's it actually like in Essex?
Well, the first thing to say is he's the only mainstream politician doing that kind of stuff, which again, the fact we're talking about the harassment he is under, speaks to a bigger point, which is no mainstream politician is doing that kind of activism. I personally think he should be applauded for that, and I would like to see people on the left and the right spending as much energy condemning that violence as they have when it's affected mainstream politicians. Because if something happens to Nigel Farage in this campaign or future campaigns, it's on everybody. It's on everybody. And the other thing about Clacton, I didn't see any hostility to Farage in Clacton. A couple of people shouting from cars driving by and so on. I mean, there was one family who turned up at a sort of classic working class family, flags being draped from the windows. And of course, they call Clacton Little Dagenham because Clacton became home to many of the people who left London's East End over the last 20 years. It was a big movement, really, white flight out of London's East End into Clacton. So they still call Clacton Little Dagenham. And Farage, I watched him come up to his working class home, multi-generational. The mother was a classic Essex lady, dressed to the nines, looked great. Grandma sat behind, beach chair, XL bully dog by her side, 2 young kids playing football on the AstroTurf. Mother loved Farage. Nigel loved you, watched you in I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here. Absolutely loved Farage. In the background, the grandma, 2 fingers up. F off, Farage. Why don't you call your friend Donald? Just classic English scene. The English scene. Working class, solid, patriotic, anti-establishment. Here's the thing about Clacton.
But he's divisive with...
Well, only some of them. Here's why he's going to win Clacton. It already elected a Farage MP, a UKIP MP in 2014, Douglas Carswell. It was the only seat in the country that re-elected a UKIP MP in 2015. It's got a very rebellious, independent streak to it as a seat. Yes, it voted Conservative in 2017 with Theresa May. Yes, it voted Conservative with Boris Johnson in 2019, but only because at that point the Conservatives were sounding very Farage-east. They were saying, actually, we want to cut down migration. We want to deliver Brexit.
Are those the key issues for people?
Those are some of the key issues. But what Farage is telling people locally is, if you elect me, they will never be able to ignore Clacton, which is actually quite a powerful message. He's also campaigning on D-Day, Rishi's big mistake, which, remember, Clacton, one of the oldest seats in the country with lots of veterans. They really don't like that. And he's also saying to people, look, put me in Westminster. I will say out loud what you're thinking. The reaction is very positive. I can say I've seen some of the data down there. It looks pretty good for him. Now, remember, if he wins, that's step one of realigning the right or realigning British politics. If he loses, maybe something disastrous happens with his campaign. Maybe it's not organised enough. Maybe he underestimates the Labour vote, which is unlikely given that Labour are standing a paper candidate, a sort of 20-something politics graduate. Unlikely to see that happen. But let's say it goes wrong. Then it is over for Farage. I mean, if he doesn't win Clacton, it's over. There will be no realignment of the right. What I suspect he'll end up with, and I'm not usually wrong, I think 1 or 2 seats. 1 or 2 seats, Clacton, possibly Boston Skegness, unlikely, but Richard Tice, so his deputy. I say 1 or 2 seats, 5 million votes, 5 million plus, and maybe around 150, 200 second places. Now that's where it gets interesting. Fast forward to the morning after the election, July the 5th. Here's a speech Farage will give. I'm in Parliament. We're second in 150 plus seats, with the main opposition to the Labour Party in a larger chunk of Britain than the Conservatives. The Tories are finished. I'm now leading the official opposition. That will be the speech. He will invite the British people to join that revolt. He will say, whether you're Labour, Conservative, none of the above, the Reform Party is now the major opposition, and he will go and try and replicate the 1993 Canada-style takeover of conservatism. And if he's smart, and he's got smart people around him, he won't just say he's interested in realigning the Conservatives. He'll say he's interested in realigning the whole country. And he'll issue an invitation to everybody in Britain who's fed up with the elite class. And one of the more interesting things, I've known Farage for 15 years, okay? I've known him a long time. He now accepts this isn't just the Nigel Farage show. He watches a lot of content. He watches a lot of YouTube shows. He watches a lot of, debates. He's plugged into the culture. Most of his advisors and aides are in their 20s, early 30s. They're watching, shows like this. They're watching, reading the Substacks. They're doing, on YouTube. He now accepts, Farage, that he needs to begin to prepare how he will pass the baton down to a new generation. And he now accepts, I think, that he is one part of a broader coalition of people that need to come together to reshape British politics. Gender-critical people who oppose what's happening in our schools. Young Gen Z, millennial conservatives who are utterly sick and tired of the Tories who have not given them any stake in the housing market or capitalism at all. The none of the aboves. The 30% of people in this country who refuse to vote for anybody in Westminster politics, the left behind regions, who everybody from Boris to Rishi said would be levelled up, and they didn't really get anything at all. I think Farage senses his real power can come from being one person in a wider team. And if that's genuine, that becomes really interesting.
There's a lot of what you just said that I want to pick on, but let's start with two things. Firstly, his idea of being the real opposition. He might say that, but if he's only got 1 or 2 seats in Westminster for the next 5 years, he's not in practice the real opposition. It's a sentiment almost.
So what happens? Let's play hypotheticals. As we're talking, Conservatives and Reform are basically level pegging in the polls. What happens if Reform end up going, after the next election, 5-10 points ahead of the Conservatives? What happens if more Conservatives defect to Farage? What if some big donors fall in behind him and say, we'll give you 5-10 million quid because we believe this is the future? What happens if he is actually second to Labour in 100 plus seats? What if he's more popular in the Red Wall than the Conservatives? What if the Conservatives are reduced to 100 seats in the South East and East Anglia, and they're basically a very small, largely insignificant political party that are dependent upon One Nation Liberals who won't talk about the issues Farage will talk about? We can argue, yes, they'll have more MPs than Farage, and technically they'll be a bigger parliamentary group, but symbolically, out there in the country, I think he will be able to say, I am now a serious political force that cannot be ignored. Now, will he then do what he needs to do to capitalise on that? Will he get good people around him, experienced people around him? Will he attract good money? Will he broaden his policy portfolio? Will he actually connect with Gen Z and millennials in the same way that Le Pen is doing, or Maloney is doing, or the Sweden Democrats are doing? Those are all strategic questions. But is his fundamental diagnosis of British politics right now correct? That the main parties are not representing millions of people, that millions of people want a completely different economic model, and they want to preserve and protect their culture? I think his diagnosis is correct. So I think, therefore, he is asking the right questions. Can he now get people around him who want to turn questions into answers?
Do you think that the Tories can be saved after this? Because I assume that they're not going to let Farage take over their party, and that they're going to continue with this. You see Penny Mordaunt up there. Are we just going to get Penny Mordaunt running the Tories? If they think that that's the answer, they're just not asking the right questions. Is this... here's another way of asking the question: where exactly is the other talent? And this actually also applies for Farage. If he wants to, he's saying this applies for Labour just as much. I look at Westminster; it doesn't matter where there's not much talent.
Everybody is unpopular. Everybody in Westminster currently is unpopular. Everybody's ratings are terrible. Keir Starmer is just about treading water. Rishi Sunak's rating after D-Day plunged to minus 27.
Wait, hang on. What do you mean Starmer?
He's like plus 5, plus 6, his leadership ratings.
Oh, right.
Tony Blair in 1997 was plus 50. Okay, this guy is not capturing the British imagination. Rishi Sunak is in what I call Prince Andrew territory. He's minus 30, right? This is what happens when you basically laugh at or you disrespect much of the country. But it's true. I mean, that's where he is. This is the thing. You don't hear this from columnists in Britain. Rishi Sunak is one of the most unpopular prime ministers we've ever had. The data's pretty clear on that. Nobody will say it because they like him. They like the idea that this is what politics should look like: diverse, technocratic, managerial. But millions of voters are looking at Rishi Sunak like, you don't represent me. You don't even have a mandate. Sunak doesn't even have a mandate. He was appointed. He's never established a conversation with the country, and he's never told the country where he wants to lead it. So that is fundamentally a problem. Historically, the power of the Conservatives was the power to renew. But we've seen no evidence of that over the last year. There has been no ideological renewal. Why is that? I would say it's because there is nobody within the Conservative Party capable of delivering another ideological renewal. Compare Rishi Sunak to Margaret Thatcher, or compare Boris Johnson to Margaret Thatcher. Thatcher had serious people around her. Thatcher had thinkers, had a completely different theory about economics and inflation. Serious people, well-read, intellectuals. You might disagree with them, but people like Keith Joseph and others were brilliant people. Who was around Boris Johnson? Who was around Rishi Sunak? Okay, you might say, well, people like Dominic Cummings. Well, I've got a theory for how I might reform the civil service. Okay, fine. That's not a brains trust. That is in a way technocracy. That's not ideas. That's not philosophy. And I don't think the Conservatives have a guiding philosophy anymore. You can see it in just their answer to everything is slash taxes. 1988, the Lawson budget.
Except they've hiked taxes.
It's like they're living in they want to live in 1988. They've raised taxes, but also they lost sight of the fact that only a third of this country want to cut taxes. The rest of the British people either want to keep taxes where they are, or they actually want to pay more if it means they have a good national service that actually works, they have good local GPs, they have good schools, because one of the biggest issues at this election is public services and whether they're working, and clearly many people feel they're not. The Tories, I just think, are intellectually bankrupt. They don't have serious people around them. The whole Westminster scene is just very hollow, intellectually, philosophically.
This is my frustration.
Full of
I don't
spads.
see any talent.
There is no talent, but that also speaks to the enormous opportunity for something new, for something radical, for something that is anchored in evidence and serious ideas and can be shaped around some interesting North Stars and can communicate that story to the country and say, look, this is not what you're used to. This is going to be different, but it's going to be radical, but it's going to take you to a better place.
You talked about Trump, you wrote about Trump in your book, National Populism, and now just zooming out again to the global level, obviously the presidential election coming up in the States. What's your take in the similarities with what's going on in Europe, what's going on here in Britain, to what's going on in America? What does a Trump presidency look like for the world? What is this the same thing as issues of immigration, patriotism? It's the same failures of the elites over there. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I read an interesting piece, I think it was in The Atlantic by Anne Applebaum, saying, don't draw parallels between Europe and Trump, as in, the rise of populism in Europe doesn't necessarily mean that Trump's going to play well in America. I personally think that's kind of another example of liberal elites keeping their heads in the sand. I mean, clearly the populist mood is back. Clearly the populist moment is back. And if you look at all the polling in the US, as we sit here talking in the early summer of 24, Trump's ahead in the national polls, but he's ahead in every single battleground state. Only 24% of Americans think the country's heading in the right direction. Biden's approval ratings are pretty weak. Trump is looking stronger than he was in 2016. Will he win? I don't know. My gut instinct is probably he will, and if he does, it will be because of the chaos on the southern border. The numbers there are bananas, 200 to 300,000 people crossing in one recent month. The economy is okay, but it's not doing gangbusters, and there's a lot of concern about America's the threats to America from abroad. It doesn't, and the collapse of the cities inside the country and so on, and the sense of disorder and chaos. Trump, I think, plays well for all of that. Biden is weak, visibly, physically, intellectually. And if Trump does end up winning, we'll see, I think, a stronger push on economic protectionism, the kind of patriotic protectionism, what he's calling it, more reshoring, tougher lines against China, trying to revive American industry. You'll see the border security issue be prioritized. You'll see issues around migration and crime be prioritized. How he handles the state, I think, will be very different from the first time. If he's learned his lesson and he listens to some of the think tanks around him, he will be saying, okay, actually what I need to do is not just take the White House, but I need to have good, 500 to 1,000 appointments of ideologically aligned people in key positions within the state to ensure I can get done what I need to get done. Now, if he can do that, then obviously it will be a more effective presidency than the first one. But I think he's got a good chance. Generally speaking, if you pan out and you look at 24, you look at France, you look at the rest of Europe, you look at where Britain is, you look at where the polling is in America, the big message for me is nearly 10 years on from 2016, these populist movements are as strong, if not stronger, than they were nearly a decade ago. And millions of voters are saying to the elites, once again, listen, you either address my concerns or I'm going to keep sending these guys into office. And I'm going to keep sending these guys into political power. So again, it comes back to the elites. And you know this from your debate at the Oxford Union. I watched that debate. I watched Nancy Pelosi shouting you down. It was a symbol of everything that is wrong with the elite class. I remember Andrew Sullivan writing, what you have to remember is we're living through the greatest radicalization of the elite class in recent history, since at least the 1960s. And he was on the money. That is what we're living through. And if you just view our world and society through that lens, rather than the evil, ignorant, misinformed, disinformed voters, if you look at it through the lens of the radicalization of the elite class, not just in politics, but media, culture, creatives, publishing, it just makes a lot more sense. And that's how I view the world today.
Well, that's a pretty extensive picture of populism, or maybe an introduction to Matt Goodwin's version or a concept of populism. Matt, thank you so much. Is there anything you feel like we should cover that we didn't cover, that you feel like that was a pretty good
I just think if you're interested in this topic, you have to read some of the countercultural takes on this, because it's not about making the case for populism. It's about being aware that most of the people who write on this topic, and I know Elon Musk and others, and you've made this argument as well, a lot of the people who write on this topic, who shape the parameters of the debate around populism and politics, are themselves very political people. So you need to step outside of what you're reading in the mainstream press. You need to really interrogate books and articles that offer a different view. Start with Chris Lash, Revolt of the Elites. Go from there.
Curiously,
read some of the. But Chris Coldwell is another really good writer on European populism. Read The Road to Somewhere by David Goodhart. Read some of Roger Scruton's works, or some of Douglas Murray's. Read my own book on national populism. Challenge yourself. You don't have to agree with these books, but challenge yourself to have a different view around what's going on, because the dominant view, I would argue, is written mainly by people on the radical left.
The interesting about Christopher Lash's book is that actually he's almost like a populist of the left. He hates the rich. He's really bitter and angry about the rich, not just the political elites, which I think he's right about. But so that shows me that, and he was someone who could see ahead, that this could quite easily have been a left-wing populist movement, and there have been left-wing populist movements. I talked about this with Pelosi. Corbyn would be a good example here, Bernie in the States. But it's apart from the famous examples of, let's say, Venezuela and Mexico, it's striking that there is an somewhat economically right-wing aspect to all of these populist movements. Well, or certainly there's a culturally right-wing aspect.
Never forget, left-wing populists prioritise class. Right-wing populists prioritise culture. And that is the fundamental difference between the two. Yes, national populists might have a strong working class following, but their starting point is not class, it is culture. And they're tapping into the fact that people out there care about their national culture. They care about who they are. The left has never really understood that, never really understood what to do with that. And that's the important point. Lash is one of those writers I wish we could bring him back to life and say, look at what happened, because he called it all. And also, by the way, The Culture of Narcissism is another great book. Daniel Bell is another one. Go back and read The Cultural Contradictions of Capitalism. Daniel Bell saw all of it. The rise of the adversary class, the rise of an elite class that basically hate their own country. He talked about this in the 1960s, 1970s. A lot of those guys. My good friend, your friend, Eric Kaufman, his stuff is really good on this. If you want to challenge yourself, read a book like White Shift, or his new book, Taboo, or in America, The Third Awakening. These are people who are openly challenging the elite consensus in how we think about these issues. And in today, more than ever, you have to expose yourself to ideas that will challenge you and thinkers that will challenge you.
I'm reminded as you talk now of this clip of Rory Stewart and Alistair Campbell on their horrendous podcast.
Well, they never invite anyone else on who might disagree
but they were trying to argue against populism, but neither of them were able to strongman what populism was. They weren't able to define it. And if you want to defeat an idea, if you strawman it, you will never be able to defeat it. So anyone who's listening to this conversation and is triggered by it and thinks they're squirming in the street, like Pelosi was squirming in her seat when she was in front of me at Oxford, if you want to contend with this shit, go and bloody read these books and try and understand it. Strongman the position before you. I think the scary thing is if they do that, if they end up worrying that they might end up agreeing with it. That's probably why they don't want to do it. But
also, just my last point, because this is one of the reasons I'm an optimist about the future, because you can put a discussion like this together online. We could have hundreds of thousands, millions of clicks. Your videos, I've seen them going absolutely viral. The Oxford Union, you put across a different view about populism, what it is. This is why they're scared, because they no longer control the public marketplace of ideas. And you can have 20 podcasts that all offer the same liberal, centrist, centre-left view of the world. But now there's a new ecosystem. There's a new ecosystem of YouTubers and Substackers and Unhearders and et cetera, which is powerful and influential. So my view is that's a great thing to happen. Let's support it, help shape it. It's why I talk regularly on new media, the new ecosystem, because I genuinely believe in it. We have to diversify the marketplace of ideas. It's not just about political parties and voting. It is the water in which the fish swim, right? And that's what we are helping to shape and flavor.
I'll give you, just in case it's interesting, but from my point of view, running this YouTube channel, in one way in which it's been easy is there are some topics which everyone cares about, but the mainstream media are too scared for politically correct reasons to even touch. Islamism is a great one. Populism is one. They won't touch it, but the masses care about it. So in a sense, it's quite an easy job. You see these huge gaps in the marketplace of ideas. You just have to. You don't even have to be particularly bright. I'm certainly not particularly bright, and you just talk about.
You also see how the gatekeepers respond. I mean, I always get calls, for example, from some of the more, let's say, flagship BBC shows. Right? I don't want to name the shows, but we all know what they are. So, we're having an interesting discussion about a European election. Would you like to come on the panel? And then they go away and they do their research. Then you get the phone call, which is, my editors decided to take this in a slightly different direction, which basically is code for, we have gone away and researched and understood that you have a countercultural view, which is different from the consensual view in the elite institutions. And that is not conspiratorial. I've been told this by
but you do a lot of mainstream media.
I do some mainstream media, but I've never, there are reasons, I think, why I've not been on some of the really massive shows, because I think when you are openly challenging the elite consensus and you can back it up with evidence and facts and you're well read in your research, which is what everybody viewing this show, it's very easy to do that. Just invest time, read every day, just read and snowball from one book to another. That guy mentions that guy, right? I better read him. That guy's footnoted to that woman. Okay, I'm going to read her. Just go. Snowball. Become your own researcher. You don't have to go to university for that. But when they realize that, they'll always back off. They won't have you on. They're scared, because a lot of the people who are gatekeeping these institutions are themselves not particularly bright. They're deeply ideological. They might not know it. They might not realize it. But because they've gone through the institutions, they've been socialized in a particular worldview. And so anybody that challenges that, you see it on the BBC homepage every day. It's like, I click on the BBC homepage every morning because I want to see the liberal progressive view of the world. And it's like, there's our identity politics story, our LGBT story. Okay, there's our evil far right story. Okay, and it is a kind of template of the liberal progressive worldview. When you're challenging that and you can back it up with arguments and evidence, they get scared and they won't engage with you.
Matt, I'll ask you one last question, because this is now the third time you've been on my show. Once when I was at The Spectator. And,
right, yeah.
Once earlier this year, we did a whole superb episode on immigration, which I recommend to listeners if you want to really understand what's going on in immigration in Britain. But you alluded to your dad earlier and your granddad being Labour supporters. You've also said that you now support reform. So there's a political movement change there within generations of the same family. And I'm just curious on a personal level, like you, Matt, like you're clearly someone who's passionate about these things. You read extensively and you clearly care about this country. Even listeners who might completely disagree with everything you say, they couldn't possibly deny that you care about society and this country. I'm just curious about where that comes from, or where that passion comes from, and maybe a little bit about your journey, why there's that change.
Well, I think when you write a lot about, I think when you get to a certain point in your life, I'm 42, I think you really start to reflect on what you want to do with what is left, what the time you have left. And I think For some people, writing about what is happening is enough and sufficient. And I think there are other people that want to try and make things happen and try and change the way things are. And I've definitely felt myself tilting into that side of things over the last 10 years. And part of that was about Brexit and the reaction to Brexit and what I saw in the elite institutions and what happened after that. Part of it was the experience of seeing a country I love being reduced to what we live in today, with an elite class that clearly isn't thinking rationally, coherently, and with the evidence in mind. Is just imposing dogma on everybody else. The other is having a daughter, having a child. It just changes the way you see the world, and the stakes go up enormously. And also just having a palpable sense, like many people, I think, in Britain, Europe, and probably America too, a palpable sense that we are now rapidly approaching a civilizational moment. And what do I mean by that? I mean a moment where the things that make us and us, our history, our values, our way of life, our culture, are being rapidly eroded, if not being destroyed altogether. I certainly feel that moment, that this isn't about policy, it's not about transactional politics, it's not about leaders, it's not really even about political ideology. It is this more existential, deep-rooted, sometimes overwhelming sense that we are losing what it is that makes us and us. And I think many people out there feel that, and I think they're looking at leaders and they're thinking, you don't have the answers to this, or you're not even willing to recognize what is happening. Never mind, do something about it. I certainly feel that. So I think it's kind of age colliding with recent political events, colliding with this, what are we leaving behind, and how on earth are the next generation and the generation after that? What is life going to be looking like for our children and their children, and that changes the calculation that you make.
Matt Goodwin, on that note, a great pleasure as ever, and all the best on your ongoing endeavors. And
you too, and this wonderful show, which I love watching every time you have a new video.
Yeah, I appreciate that. You always send a very nice text message, and the bits you like. Or
I literally watch every interview on this show. So
awesome. Well, Matt, thank you.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you for listening and watching The Winston Marshall Show with me, Winston Marshall. I want to know what you think. What are the topics that you want to hear about? Do you want to have more conversations about the upcoming elections in this country, in Britain, and in America? What are the other topics the mainstream media are not covering that you want to understand, get to grips with, learn more about? And are there any guests you want on the show? Let me know in the comments. It's super helpful. Otherwise, if you want to support the show, all you have to do is press subscribe. If you press subscribe, I can have more great guests like Matt Goodwin covering the issues you want to hear about. But otherwise, thank you, and I will see you next time.